Chris Phillips joins us today. He is the producer, manager, janitor, you name it, at the Spurs Up show. Chris has become a good friend of ours. We spent a lot of time with him at Media Days. We're doing this late July. This is a week after Shane Beamer and all the other 13 SEC coaches. We got to see them at Media Day in my hometown of Nashville. Chris drove up for it. We spent a lot of time with them. Chris, appreciate you joining us today. It's been really fun hanging out with you, and we're going to have a fun conversation about an interesting program in the South Carolina Gamecocks because, boy, there were opinions on this program. Inside the fan base, outside it, we're going to hit all corners today. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, Chris, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to meet you guys at SEC Media Days in Nashville, Tennessee. You know, that was the biggest blessing and something the thing I'm most grateful for at Media Days was it was fun talking to coaches and players and the storylines, but getting to meet people that you've connected with from afar or you've done work with or you've admired their work from afar. And so getting to meet you guys in person, that truly was the greatest blessing of the week. So, Chris, I appreciate you having me. Excited to talk ball. And like I mentioned, I've been following you guys for a while. Y'all do a fantastic job with Southeastern 14. And as I've leaned into talking more SEC football and SEC sports than I ever have before, I've actually leaned on you guys a lot to kind of keep up with what's going on in regards to all the sports, baseball, basketball, football. You guys do a great job. And again, it's an honor and a privilege to come on the airwaves and talk some ball with you.
Well, thank you. We sure had fun at Media Days last week. And let's jump right into Carolina. I think the thing that's always interesting is you have a perception of the program that you cover. Everybody's in their own silo in this league, and so you only know South Carolina from afar. Was there anything Shane Beamer said at Media Days or the players that stood out or maybe surprised you or went against something you thought?
And Chris, to your point, by the way, I learned a lot about the other schools, almost not even from the coaches themselves or the players, but again, interacting with folks that cover these teams and they know beyond the coach speak and what's going on behind the scenes. So when you cover the teams, me for South Carolina, you for Vandy, when you cover the teams as closely as we do, when your coach takes the podium or your players speak, they're probably not going to say anything that you haven't already heard to this point. But I will tell you, one thing that stood out to me that Shane Beamer pointed out, and it was something that, we knew that South Carolina, they're going to be depending on a lot of new faces going into this season. But I think Shane Beamer really, Chris, put it into perspective when he mentioned 38 new players are on this roster from the end of season last year. And he went as far as to say that South Carolina is going to play freshmen at every single position on the football field. So that really just to me stood out in the sense of there's a lot of returning experience for sure, but they're going to be relying on a lot of young talent, transfer portal talent. They're going to be relying on a lot of new faces. And I tell you this, Chris, if you think back to when South Carolina and Shane Beamer was there, obviously, but you think back to Steve Spurrier, their heyday when they got it going in 2009, then of course 2010, they won the SEC East. Then 2011, they won 11 games. They did that 3 years in a row. They did have a lot of production and guys burst on the scene as true freshmen. In 2009, it was Stephon Gilmore and Alshon Jeffrey. In 2010, it was Marcus Lattimore. In 2011, it was Jadeveon Clowney, et cetera, et cetera. There are many that I'm not mentioning. So for Shane Beamer to, come out and just publicly say that, we're a young football team, we're going to be playing a lot of freshmen. I think for South Carolina to pop this year, they're going to need a lot of these new guys, whether it be freshmen or transfer portal, to step up and be big-time impact guys for them, not just role players. Outside of that, Chris, I thought Shane Beamer was just his charismatic, energetic self. You mentioned, we talked about it off air, he's one of the favorites in the SEC right now amongst the media because he's such a personable guy. He's genuine. He's authentic. He's just a real dude, right? I know we kind of, we talked a bit about Kirby Smart, and there's some others where it's just they're so hardcore football all the time. They're like robots, basically. A guy like Shane Beamer, a guy like Sam Pittman, maybe even Billy Napier comes off as he's just a guy. He's a normal dude like you and I, and he just happens to be the head football coach at an SEC school. So, I thought Shane Beamer was well composed at SEC Media Days. I think he's very confident in his football team, but certainly I think he addressed that they have question marks as well and things that they'll have to answer if they want to have the type of season that, they're shooting for in 2023.
Yeah, Chris, I want to get into Shane Beamer in a minute. I want to get into the roster. You mentioned all those things. 36 is a lot of new guys. That's
38. 38, actually.
38, excuse
38.
me. Well, 36 would be a lot too. But
yeah.
Look, there are mixed signals with this program, right? Because on one hand, you look at them, I sort of do a computer composite. I average SP Plus, ESPN's FPI, Sagarin. There's another one or two in there that are mainstream. South Carolina ranked 36 nationally last year. Scoring margin, 3.3 a game. Turnover rate on offense, 3.2% of snaps. That's really bad. And yet, they beat Clemson. They boat raced Tennessee. They gave Notre Dame all it wanted in a bowl game that it lost. This is a program that you look back by that same computer composite. Will Muschamp was 91st in the country his last year. Beamer brought them to 66 in that composite in his first year, where they didn't have a quarterback. They had 4 of them. Some of them it played at places I'd never heard of, to be honest. So I think he's doing a good job. I don't want anybody to get it twisted, but there are things that are just all over the place with them. I didn't think they looked good the first couple of months of the last couple of seasons. Then they pop up and dominate Tennessee and Clemson. How do you make sense of all these mixed signals of where they've been as a program?
Chris, it is really hard to make sense. And, I know Gamecock fans get tired of it because, to your point, the computers hate South Carolina. I mean, the last 3 years, you look at them and, Kelly Ford, ESPN, FBI's got, we saw it at SEC Media Days. They show the graphic on the screen, and South Carolina projected to win 5.6 games this year, and Gamecock fans just can't understand it. And I was actually asked a couple of days ago, like, who's more correct? The people who are going to preseason rank South Carolina in the top 25 or believe they're going to win 8 or 9 games, or are the computers right? And I think you look at South Carolina and you really do have to go back and give a lot of credit to Shane Beamer, that coaching staff, because realistically, probably the first 2, they have overachieved the first 2 years. That first year, Chris, they were probably a 4 or 5 win football team. Let's just call it for what it is. Last year, they were probably a fringe 6-6 team. But because of coaching, because of winning in special teams, I'm not sure how much the computers really factor that in. And, it's funny. I talk to people about special teams. We do these team previews, and I ask them about special teams, and they kind of laugh or scoff. Like, people think, oh, special teams, who cares? But, dude, at South Carolina, that's been a game changer for them. That's been how they've won and lost football games, also being opportunistic on defense. So, some will label that as great coaching and finding ways to win. Others, Chris, just call it for what it is. We'll call it smoke and mirrors. And I think we're going to find out a lot this year about which of those two it more so is. Because to your point, Chris, last year, for the first 10 games, they were just a bad football team. There's really no other way to put it. They were handcuffed by their offensive coordinator, but they didn't play good football. Spencer Rattler made poor decisions. The offensive line wasn't very good. They couldn't stop a nosebleed last year defensively, much less the running game. So, and you mentioned, right, that game in Nashville against Vanderbilt. I think Gamecock fans forget South Carolina won that game by
both those teams look bad.
It was sloppy. Yeah. It was and that was coming off the embarrassment to Mizzou, and then you get shellacked by Florida. And Chris, Carolina was headed right down the road of 6-6, and we'd be having a much different conversation right now had the season played out like we all thought it would. So, I say this. Going into year 3, again, I don't think either side is wrong when you talk about which side are you going to give more credence to. The numbers which say South Carolina should be an average football team, or Shane Beamer, his coaching staff, and the culture that he's built, which is obviously built to overexceed expectations, which they have done the first 2 years. So it is fascinating, though, Chris, because you ask me, like, which version is South Carolina more of? I don't know. None of us really know. That's why I feel like 7-5 kind of feels, I don't know if it's the safe pick, but it feels like the right pick for South Carolina, because at this point, I feel like there's going to be games where the Gamecocks look clueless. There's also going to be games where, because of Shane Beamer's special teams being opportunistic, Spencer Rattler having one of those games, they're going to pop off and probably beat somebody they shouldn't. At the end of the day, I think that's going to be around a 7-5 football team. We shall see. But it is fascinating when you factor in there's so many statistics that say they should not be doing what they're doing, and yet Shane Beamer and company find a way to do so anyways.
Well, I think Carolina is kind of an outlier for 2 reasons I'll get into. One, of special teams. I don't think a lot of people spend a lot of time looking at special teams. They weren't just really good. They were elite.
They were the best. They were the best.
Yeah. And whether that's sustainable or not, like, I've not done a deep dive into sustainability over years on special teams and what you can keep doing and what you can't, because a lot of those things are based on, I'm not going to say fluke plays, but block punts and fake field goals that go for But, here's the thing. I keep watching them and going, okay, well, first of all, this guy's dad, everybody knew Frank Beamer was the special teams genius to beat all special teams geniuses. Shane Beamer has done, and by the way, I thought Shane Beamer had a great comment when asked about being one of the few guys that wasn't a coordinator. He said, well, I was a special teams coordinator. And I think that better prepares you to be a head coach because you deal with both sides of the ball. And I thought that was, I'd never heard it explained like that. That was a brilliant answer. But here's the point I'm getting at. I think with them, you feel like, trickery is coming, whether it's a fake punt, a fake field goal, block. Like, I feel like that's no secret when you play South Carolina. Like, if you were a coach at any level on any part of a staff playing against them, and you don't know that they're elite on special teams, and something weird is coming, then you should be fired yesterday because everybody knows it. But yet they keep pulling it off, right? So I don't know how they keep doing that, but they do, and it's just part of their DNA. The other thing, we rate things with computers. I think that's important. I think that strips out a lot of the bias and it puts everybody on equal footing. But football's played by human beings. And this is an era in which I think the psychology and the building of a culture is more important than ever, because as Lane Kiffin talked about last week, kids, if they have a bad practice or don't like the way they're coached, they can hit the portal. And certainly Carolina had some of that, which I think a lot of teams do. So they're not alone in that. And I'm speaking a lot to get to the point. You look at when Carolina has played its best ball. It's at the end of the year where some of these teams, you got kids that have got one foot out the door because they're getting texted by their staffs. They're having NIL conversations with other programs. To me, the way that he has kept that team together down the stretch and played its best football in November and even into December the last 2 years, to me, that's something that is probably more important than it's ever been, because this is a different era of college football the last 3 or 4 years than we've ever seen. And I think, to me, that's where you take a little bit of what the computers say over here and over there. And that's maybe one of the 4 or 5 programs in the country, or I think you throw it out a little bit more just because of those dynamics.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, it's incredibly impressive the way they have responded to adversity. And they've done so the first 2 years. I mean, you think about, they've had some ugly performances. I think back to year one, they go to Texas A&M. You look up in the third quarter, South Carolina has 11 yards of offense. 11, not 111, 11. 11 total yards of offense. They find a way later in that season, beat Florida at home, beat Auburn, punch their ticket to bowl eligibility. You look at last year. I mean, Georgia early in the season, that game was over in the third quarter. Stetson Bennett was taking selfies 10 minutes left in the game with fans in the stands. I mean, you look at that Florida game, losing 38-6. And I mean, to come out of that ball game, and I actually heard Shane Beamer on the radio yesterday talking about, coming out of that game, we were a confident bunch. We felt like, we had full confidence we could beat Tennessee. And I'm listening and I'm like, I believe him, but it's almost hard to believe that. Like, you really felt like everybody in that locker room felt like they could go out there and beat the 5th-ranked Tennessee Volunteers, who were a 24-point favorite. But they do. And I think it's because of Shane Beamer's, again, infectious positivity. I mean, he is a guy that probably when you're around him is nauseatingly positive. I don't say that as an insult either, but he's just one of those dudes, no matter the situation, he's going to look at it glass half full. He's going to see the best in everything. And I think that spreads to his players. And you mentioned, man, with NIL, guys 1 foot out the door. And I think what's important to point out as well, when you look at the big-time guys that left in the transfer portal, Marshawn Lloyd, Jaheim Bell, Jordan Burch, Gilbert Edmond, they're all Muschamp guys. They're all Muschamp guys. We're not really seeing that all that much with Shane Beamer's guys yet. Now, I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek because, as you know, Chris, I mean, the transfer portal spares no one. Guys will up and leave immediately, and it is what it is. That's the reality of college football. But, Shane Beamer, again, his personality, and I've said this many times, Chris, the fact that he sees South Carolina not for what it's always been, but for what it can be. I think that's one of his greatest qualities. I think that's what he sells in recruiting. And the fact he was on the staff back in 2010 when they went to the SEC championship, when they did the unthinkable, I think that helps as well because he can sell that. Like, I have seen it firsthand. I know what it looks like here, and I know it can be done. I was directly a part of it. So, yeah, when you talk about the culture, I do agree with you, man. In an era where you're having to re-recruit your own roster every single year, I mean, it's never been tougher to be a college football coach. You have to be a guy, I think, that's about culture. You have to be a dude that's about player relationships. And, we've heard from players talk about, guys want to be in the building now. With Will Muschamp, it was cliquey, and guys wanted to be anywhere but the facility. And, now it's all about, above all else, love your brother and these positive feelings. And I know that can come off kind of woo-woo to some people, you know what I mean? It can be kind of corny, but it works for them. And that's the new era of college football, and that's how you have to be, I think, with this new age of player as well.
I like him. I've never met Shane Beamer. All I know is just watching him from afar. I'm the parent of a 9-year-old who's fanatical about baseball. Hopefully he's playing it one day. We'll see how that goes. But I just look at things through a parent lens. Shane Beamer seems like the kind of guy I'd like to have coaching my kid. Are there things that I think he could do differently? Are there times I think he's a little immature with his approach with the media? Yeah, I think he gets a little sensitive and starts responding to stuff at times. He probably better just ought to leave alone. Does the Mr. Positive thing maybe wear on people at a while? I mean, that's a strange criticism, but you said it. I'll just say that's been out there. I don't have an issue with it, but I like him. I feel like he's genuine in an era where, look, college football has gotten so corporate. I mean, the people in Alabama can't even get Nick Saban. Kirby Smart's got that whole campus on lockdown. I mean, it feels like it's a prison when you talk to people that listen to how it is. And Shane Beamer just comes across differently. And, I think you've got to go with what you are, right? If you told Nick Saban or Kirby Smart to be Shane Beamer, it's not going to work for them. If you told Shane Beamer to be Nick Saban, it's not going to work. I think I like him because he seems like he's genuine. And I think when you're comfortable in your own skin, which I think he is, that's when things work. And so far it's worked.
Yeah, Chris, it's funny you mentioned, does it ever wear on people, the positivity? I mean, as well as I do, no coach is immune to losing. So it's a lot tougher to hear those positive comments. I mean, I can tell you the Tuesday presser after the 38-6 loss to Florida, I don't think anybody wanted to hear the sunshine and rainbows, find some joy type of comments. I mean, I was even, I say critical, but I gave my opinions, my thoughts. I thought Shane Beamer last year somewhat missed the mark, after the Vanderbilt game when South Carolina goes out there, they win by 11. It was a sloppy game. I think Vandy turned it over 3 or 4 times. That was coming off the upset loss to Mizzou, in which South Carolina, they had everything in front of them, had won 4 in a row, and they just laid a complete egg at home. And immediately in the postgame, the first thing Shane Beamer goes to is, our fans are talking this way on social media, find some joy. And I'm like, I don't know. It felt like to me an unnecessary remark to make to the fan base. Now, again, Shane Beamer has done far more good than bad, and so I want to make that very clear. And I love Shane Beamer, love what he's doing for the program. There's a reason I wouldn't put his name on merchandise and rock it on my body if I didn't believe in Shane Beamer and what he's doing. But there are times in the media, Chris, we were talking about this off air. There are times in the media where I think he's very snappy. He's got an edge to him, and I think obviously the diehard fanatical side of the Gamecocks fan base loves it, but it can be taken as, I'm just curious to see how his relationship with the media evolves. You know what I mean? Is that one of those things where he kind of lets it just go off? And because here's the thing, Chris, this as well as I do. When you're the head football coach, you do have somewhat of a set of rules. There are things you can't say or just shouldn't say. The media can say whatever they want. You know what I mean? Especially when you're talking about independent content creators, which there are more and more of those popping up every single day, who don't have to answer to anyone. They don't have to answer to an editor. They don't have to answer to a boss, anything of the sort. And that's not necessarily, I'm not coming off saying like that's a threat to Beamer that he better watch out. But for example, when Dowell Loggins was hired, and it was a highly scrutinized hire, and listen, Gene Sapakoff, I'm not exactly sure what publication he's with, but he wrote an article saying that $1 million is apparently the new price for mediocrity when talking about Dowell Loggins, which, listen, that's a very harsh statement. But Dowell Loggins was a very controversial hire, and Shane Beamer made sure in his presser to point out Gene Sapakoff and say, I saw your article, and basically rip into him. That's fine while you're winning, but God forbid things start to go even somewhat south. Those media guys are not going to hold back on you. They're going to remember comments like that. So anyways, I say all that to say I'm just someone I believe controlling what you can control, and I love the fact Shane Beamer, he defends his program, he defends his players, he defends his coaches, but I am curious to see just how that relationship evolves with the years. And here's the thing. If you keep winning, it'll take care of itself. But the sunshine and rainbows after big losses, it definitely wears on people at times, but I mean, you live with that because the overwhelming positivity, again, is why South Carolina, I think, is at this point under Shane Beamer.
Let's talk about the team. It's a little bit of a polarizing team. A lot of that comes from Spencer Rattler and what you think of him. And the numbers last year weren't good. I think people would point out that the last 3 or 4 games, it was a much different Spencer Rattler. They simplified the offense. There's still some holes here. The running game's not been great in a while, and they lose their best running back. They got a transfer from Newberry who'll be, I guess, one of their top guys. I don't know if the running game is where they built their team anyway. They got Juice Wells. What do you make of who they are and who they'll be this year offensively?
Yeah, Chris, I mean, when I look at the Gamecocks offense, and you mentioned, I mean, the biggest question is the running back position and the running game as a whole. This offensive line, they weren't great last year. I mean, you mentioned some of the numbers, right, talking about special teams. I mean, South Carolina was the only team in college football that won 8 games and finished outside of the top 100 in rushing offense and rushing defense. So to your point, I get like, hey, the computers don't mean anything, but on the other side, you're not going to be able to keep overachieving and hitting 8 wins if you're finishing outside of the top 100 in rushing offense and defense, and you can't protect your quarterback. You look at the offensive line, Chris, it's a concern for me. I mean, listen, they went to the portal and they added guys from Yale, Mercer, Charlotte, Western Illinois, what have you, but they returned 50 less starts than they did a season ago, and Jalen Nichols, their best offensive lineman, went down in the spring game with an injury that's probably going to keep him out the entire year. So they've got serious questions up front. And if that weren't enough in the running game, who the hell's going to be RB1, Chris? I mean, you've got Mario Anderson, the D2 transfer. You've got Juju McDowell, who's 5'7". I look at more as a scat back. He's certainly not a between the tackles type of guy. You've got a 4-star freshman in Dontavius Braswell, who I've got high hopes for. I think he could be a solid player for you. And then you've got De'Carrion Joyner, who is a folk hero in Columbia, but he spent his first 5 years playing quarterback and wide receiver. And now, Chris, he's basically being asked to be RB1. I think he's going to be RB1 going into the season. Not a lot of answers there, right? Is there an SEC caliber RB1 on this roster? That's TBD. Right now, I would say no, but that's TBD. So the running game is a huge concern. I think that's going to force them to pass the football. I mean, I would expect this team – dare I put a number on it? Dude, I think you got to be 70-30 probably pass to run this year because that's where your strengths lie. You get Juice Wells back. I think you could argue he's the best wide receiver in the SEC. You mentioned Spencer Rattler, and I talked about it on my show this morning. I think he's the biggest boom or bust quarterback in the SEC. I mean, this is a guy, he has the ability, if he plays like he did at the end of last season, we could be sitting here talking in the season, he was the best quarterback in the SEC this year. Or if he goes the other way, we could say he's a bottom third at best SEC quarterback. He is a very painfully average college quarterback. So which version of him do we get more of? They added Trey Knox out of the transfer portal at tight end. I think will be a nice weapon. But, I talked to some Arkansas guys, and they kind of had mixed feelings on him. And, South Carolina obviously needs this to be the season that he pops. They've also added Nicholas Harbor, of course, the talented 5-star freshman on the outside. They've got Eddie Lewis from Memphis at wide receiver, Amarian Brown. Xavier Legette's a guy that I think most people feel like could have a breakout season. Joshua Simon at tight end coming over from Western Kentucky. A lot of guys, the local media and local people in the building, they love him. They think he's going to be a household name by season's end. So again, Chris, I say all that to say, and then, of course, there's the Dowell Loggins factor. I mean, what do you get out of him? A guy that's never called a play at the collegiate level, not just Power 5 or SEC, collegiate level. And when he was at the NFL, he was labeled the worst play caller in the NFL. So the resume is not great, but there's a lot of positive feelings why that, number one, I think he's going to be a massive upgrade, Chris, over Marcus Satterfield because it's impossible to be worse than Satterfield was. I also want to believe that Shane Beamer and company learned from the mistakes of last year. So, Chris, when I look at this offense, I'm expecting this to be an offense. I think they'll be better than last year. I think Spencer Rattler is going to be a little bit more consistent, but I think because of their woes up front and at times they're going to be one-dimensional. I mean, it's just unavoidable. They're going to be one-dimensional. I think you're going to see similar inconsistencies to what you saw last year. I think they're going to make it a priority to get their playmakers the football. They're going to make it a priority to make things simple and make Spencer Rattler comfortable. But it's hard to win in the SEC without some sort of running game. And until we see otherwise, I just don't know how much of that they're going to be able to manufacture in this season.
Yeah, and to be fair to Spencer Rattler, there are other teams in the league that have got that wide range of quarterback play. Tennessee with Joe Milton, what's he going to be? You've seen different things over the course of his career, although the more recent sample size was pretty good. You got Alabama and whoever takes that job. But we'll not get into that because we could go a while with that. But you mentioned Eddie Lewis. That's a guy I wanted to ask you about. I think he's slated to start in the slot. Was a good player at Memphis. Had about 600 yards receiving. Was a really good returner. I don't know if he's going to end up their punt returner or not. But that's a guy that transferred in that I think is going to have a big role for them. I don't know. We hear a lot about Eddie Lewis, but that's kind of a name on this roster that I'm watching to see what they get.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, I came out of the spring game feeling like he was wide receiver too. I mean, the way that they targeted him, and I know it's just a spring game, but we saw it last year when they targeted Juice Wells repeatedly in that ball game, and you felt like coming out of that spring game, okay, this is obviously a guy they're making it a priority to get him the football. I kind of look at Eddie Lewis the same way. Again, I'm not saying he's going to be the best wide receiver in the SEC or anything, but I definitely think Eddie Lewis, dare I say, is an upgrade over some of the guys they had last year that were starting for them. So I think certainly he can provide. I mean, that's what they're looking for, Chris, on the offensive side, is just who's going to be that second guy, who's going to be that dude that takes the pressures off of Juice Wells. Because as good as he is, if you've only got one pitch, Chris, you know this as good as anybody. If you only got one guy, they're going to double him. They're going to bracket him. Defensive coordinators in this league, they're going to take him away. So who's going to be the other guy you go to? And if it's not a running game, again, you got to have that other playmaker. Is it Xavier Legette? Is it Nicholas Harbor? Is it Eddie Lewis? Is it Amarian Brown? Is it Trey Knox at tight end? Is it someone we're not mentioning? So I definitely think Eddie Lewis can be that guy. Again, I thought he looked good in the spring game. And, you know, all reports, again, from inside the building say that he had a really good spring, had a really good summer, and I think he is trying to make a big impact for them this year.
Yeah, glad you mentioned Trey Knox there, too. He's a kid from my neck of the woods. Saw him a little bit in high school. Was a top 100 recruit at one point. Bulked up as a tight end. Should be one of the better ones in the league. So that'll help, too. All right, let's talk defense for a minute before I have to go in a few minutes. Clayton White has been 2 years as the DC there. They haven't stopped the run in a while. You mentioned that earlier. Under Travaris Robinson and Muschamp's last year, 5.3 yards per running play. Same thing in White's first year. Got a little bit worse last year, 5.4 per running play. Teams are running about 55% of the time against Carolina the last 3 years just because they can. Now, the pass defense has been pretty good, but they lose some guys there, and we'll get to that in a minute. Now, where they do make it up is forcing turnovers, 2.9% of snaps 2 years ago, 2.5 last year. But stopping the run, let's start there. Do they get better in that regard this year, Chris?
Chris, I think they'll get better. I think they'll get slightly better. But, I mean, again, I go back to, can you really get worse than 198 yards per game allowed? And I know maybe Texas A&M fans, maybe they would argue because they literally were worse than that number last year. But, no, listen, I think the addition of Travian Robertson, the Gamecock great as defensive line coach, I think that's going to help. I also think the linebacker position for the first time in a while could take a step forward when you add talented freshman Pup Howard. You get Mo Kaba back from injury. And that was a really detrimental blow to that defense in week 2 against Arkansas when Kaba went out for the year. So if he's back 100%, you know, I think that's going to be a huge boost. Stone Blanton in year 2, really talented player that was a 4-star prospect of the state of Mississippi. You add Jerron Willis over from Ole Miss via the portal, who was a former 4-star prospect. So I think there's reason to believe the linebacker position could take a step forward. And, you know, I was able to ask Shane Beamer about that at SEC Media Days, and he made the point. It takes all 11. We talk about the front 4, the defensive line, but it really does take all 11. Elijah Davis at defensive tackle, a JUCO guy. He was the number 1 rated player in JUCO. Is a guy I'm really excited about. I think could help in the interior. You get Tonka Hemingway back, Alex Huntley. They need some guys up front to take that next step and kind of come into their own. Guys like TJ Sanders, Nick Barrett. You know, and on the edge, you get Jordan Strawn back from injury last year. Jatius Gear comes over from Syracuse, had 3.5 sacks last year. So I think on the edge, they should be solid. So I'll tell you this, Chris. Do they get better against the run this year? Yes. Do they finish inside the top 10 for the first time in 5 seasons in the SEC in stopping the run? I don't think so. I think baby steps. I think it's still going to take a little bit. I think the issue stopping the run, Chris, a lot of that just has to do with bodies. And there's a reason why they're recruiting the offensive line and the defensive line so heavily, because I think Shane Beamer just identifies we're not where we need to be. So I think South Carolina, I see them taking a step forward and improving. But again, I just don't think you can get much worse than you were a season ago.
Well, you've got some mixed signals in the secondary too, because they lost 2 really good corners to the league, right?
Yep.
But they had what I think both their safeties were first-team freshman All-Americans a year ago. I don't know when we've seen that before. They've got Marcellus Dial was a pretty good corner for them a year ago. 12 breakups, 3 picks. They lose a lot, but they've got a lot coming back too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Cam Smith and Darius Rush, you lose at the cornerback position. And, Marcellus Dial will take over at the cornerback one spot, a guy that people are really high on, O'Donnell Fortune on the other. And listen, I think it's very fair, Chris, that's a major question mark. I mean, you've got Nick Eamon-Warry and DQ Smith, as you mentioned, in the back end, who were freshman All-Americans a season ago. And by the way, side note, the fact that Nick Eamon-Warry did not make a preseason All-SEC team, even just the third team, to me was crazy. Just flat out crazy. Either way, that's a conversation for another day. But you look at what they have in the secondary, and I think at this point, Chris, after the first 2 seasons, the job that Torian Gray, the defensive backs coach, has done, you give him the benefit of the doubt. They're going to figure it out. But I'm going to be keeping a very close eye on it because especially you look at that first half of the schedule. Think about some of the quarterbacks and some of the offenses you're playing. Drake May in North Carolina, Carson Beck in Georgia, Will Rogers in Mississippi State, Joe Milton in Tennessee. If that pass rush isn't ready to go and making an impact early, and you've got these brand new, basically starting corners out there, and it could get kind of dicey. You know what I mean? It could get dicey. And to your point, Chris, about the pass defense has been so good, and I talked to the late great Brad Lawing, who unfortunately we lost a couple of months ago, but he served as Gamecocks defensive line coach for a while, one of the best in the business, coached at Davion Clowney. He told me this last summer, Chris, that as a defensive coach, you should never brag about how good your pass defense is because all you're telling teams is you can't stop the run because teams aren't going to throw it if they don't have to. So, admittedly, one of the reasons, 2 years ago, South Carolina had the number 1 pass defense in the SEC, but they couldn't stop the run, Chris. I mean, so, why would you throw it? So, I almost think it'd be – I'm not saying I want the pass defense to be worse statistically, but it'd be kind of a nice sign that, okay – teams don't just feel like they can run it down the Gamecocks' throats every play, right? So, I think there's questions in the secondary, but I think because of the job Torian Gray has done through his first 2 seasons, I think most fans give the benefit of the doubt that they will come along. But again, that start of the season, we're going to learn a lot just about, are Dial and Fortune on the outside ready to fill in for Smith and Rush, or is there going to be a bit of a transition period there?
Yeah, let's look at the schedule for a minute. There's one team in the league, that being Florida, that books in its schedule with tougher opening and closing opponents. Florida's got at Utah and then Florida State. Carolina, on the other hand, starts with North Carolina and Charlotte, and, of course, ends with that Clemson game, which is in Columbia this year. Really only 2 built-in wins to the schedule this year. Furman and Jacksonville State, which was FCS a year ago. And then in between, I mean, it could be worse. Mississippi State and A&M are the West opponents, so they dodge Bama and LSU. But again, not a lot of teams are playing 2 out-of-conference opponents like the 2 that they start and end with. You talked about ESPN's FPI pegging them for what, 5.7? What's the over-under on them right now in Vegas?
Over-under is 6.5 on South Carolina and Vegas. Yep.
You going over or under?
I would go, listen, if you're going to bet it, I think you have to go over. I have picked 7-5. I have gone on record and picked 7-5. I would go over. It's a no bet for me, though.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm with you on that just because of history. They've over it. Well, I mean.
And Chris, not to cut you,
record. Yeah.
Not to cut you off, but to your point about the schedule, I think the biggest key is just weather the storm in the first half because you close out the season with home games against Jacksonville State, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Clemson. So, I mean, it sets up again, and we've seen in the first 2 years, Chris, South Carolina has started somewhat slow under Shane Beamer, and they've picked it up as it's gone. But I don't think you can afford that slow start this year because I tell you, I'm saying over 7 right now. You lose to UNC week 1, and all of a sudden the expectations, they get completely reset for South Carolina because you're not beating Georgia and Athens. You're most likely, in my opinion, Chris, you're not beating Tennessee. After what happened last year, the Vols are going to be ready. If they win 1 game this year, it'll be that one.
Yeah.
I just, you got to weather the storm early. Be 3-2, be 4-2, 3-3, whatever. Even if you're 3-3, that won't kill you. You'll set yourself up with some winnable games down the stretch. You got to go to Missouri, but that's winnable. Again, Kentucky late in the season, Vandy, Jacksonville State. You have Furman early, but you just have to weather the storm early. The schedule's difficult, no doubt. It's doable, but it's certainly one of the toughest in the country.
Is there another team in the country that plays its last 4 at home?
I don't know. I thought that was
I'd like to
really
know that.
I thought that was really unique as well when the schedule came out that South Carolina closed. I mean, they don't leave Columbia, South Carolina the entire month of November, right? So, and of course you end the month of October with that game against Texas A&M at Kyle Field. So, but no, I don't know, Chris. I don't know. But, I mean, again, we've seen South Carolina start so slow. I mean, you go back to year one. They had EIU for the opener. Who cares? They almost lost to East Carolina in week 2. They got blasted by Georgia in week 3. You go back to last year. They were bad against Georgia State, Chris. If Georgia State had a capable quarterback and South Carolina doesn't block a pair of punts, South Carolina loses that game. I was there in person. It was ugly. I mean, it was ugly.
Yeah.
Week 2, the score was much closer than the game indicated in regards to Arkansas. They really dominated South Carolina up front, both sides. And then the Georgia game, I mean, the Gamecocks might as well not even showed up. Even week 4 against Charlotte, I think that game was tied at halftime. Again, the Gamecocks, Chris, they cannot afford that type of start because I tell you, you're staring down the barrel of 1-4 if you do. And nobody wants to hear that, but it is very possible with the difficulty of the schedule. You know as well as I do, Chris, momentum's a fickle mistress, both positive and negative, and it can snowball on you in a hurry if things start to go sideways.
By the way, when you see me looking off screen, that's checking the helmet schedule on the bulletin board to my right.
I love it,
man. There is no other SEC team that's got 4 in a row at home. I can confirm that based on a quick check, or 4 in a row at home to end the season. Now, nationally, I don't know. I don't have everyone's in front of me, but that, as you said, that's unusual. I'm sure it's happened before, but it's not
especially to close out the season. That's unique. That's very unique.
Right. Yeah, like to start the season, I bet you Kentucky. Yeah. Well, no. Kentucky goes to Vandy in week 3. But I mean, Kentucky always schedules, half the MAC in September, and they're all at home. So anyway, you do say it front loaded, but back loaded, it's usually a different story because those are generally populated by conference games. But Chris, I've got to run in a minute. Thank you for your time. This has been great. I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and I have a feeling we'll have you on again during football season. And look forward to that. Tell folks how they can follow what you do, your merchandise. You got a booming merchandise business, which I didn't know till we talked at Media Days. But tell everybody where they can get what you're offering.
Yeah, Chris, I appreciate you. And again, it was a pleasure and a true honor to meet you guys at SEC Media Days and connect. And definitely looking forward to chatting more so, having you back on, having the rest of the Southeastern 14 team on during the football season. We definitely got to get Blaine on to talk more about his TikTok and Shane Beamer comments. Yes. Sure. But no, that was a lot of fun. No, so we're on
that would be very, if we get you and Blaine on at the same time.
Yeah.
That would be
hey, why not Georgia week? I say, why not? Let's do it.
Right.
Yeah, so we're at the Spurs Up Show, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, literally anywhere you can find content, we are there. We air a daily live show on YouTube called The Daily Crow, which is at our YouTube page, the Spurs Up Show, of course, but it's nicknamed The Daily Crow. Airs noon to 3 Eastern, Monday through Friday, and we do take questions, comments, and calls from everyone. So anybody who's listening, if you're not a Gamecock fan, you want to chime in, talk some ball, talk some smack, you're more than welcome to do so. And then our podcast distributes daily under the name The Spurs Up Show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, 5 p.m. Eastern daily, Monday through Friday. And our stores over at thespursupshow.com or tsus.store. We got the Beamer Ball stuff. We've got all the Gamecock stuff you can think of. And you never know, Chris, over the next couple of months, we might even dive into some SEC-wide merch. You just never know. But no, again, my man, I appreciate you allowing me to chat some ball with you, talk some ball, and looking forward to a great 2023 season.
Yeah, you've been a great guest. Thanks for joining us. Really looking forward to getting to know you better through the coming year. Enjoyed our time in Nashville, and we'll see you again soon.
Appreciate it, Chris.